Welcome to another discussion here in PED 4, Assessment of Learning. So we are now in our lesson 4, using assessment to plan future learning goals. So as our introduction, assessment of skill attainment is actually relatively easier than assessment of understanding and other mental abilities. Skills can be practiced and are readily demonstrable. Either the skill exists at a certain level or it does not. While on the other hand, assessment of learning or assessment of understanding is much more complex. We can assess a person's knowledge in a number of ways, but we need to infer from certain indicators of understanding through written description, just like what we have mentioned on our previous lessons. Now, there are principles of good practice in assessing learning outcomes. The first one is the assessment of student learning starts with the institution's missions and core values. So what does this mean? This means that there should be a clear statement on the kinds of learning that the institution values most for its students. Another one, assessment works best when the program has a clear statement of objectives aligned with the institutional mission and core values. Such alignment ensures clear, shared, and implementable objectives. The third one is outcomes-based assessment. Focuses on the student activities that will still be relevant after formal schooling concludes. So this approach, or the approach, is to design assessment activities that are observable and less abstract, such as to determine the student's ability to write a paragraph, which is more observable than to determine the student's ability. Next is assessment requires attention not only to the outcomes but also and equally to the activities and experiences that lead to the attainment of learning outcomes. So when we say assessment, it also requires attention to the outcomes. Now, it is also and equally to the activities and experiences. It is not just the process, but also not just the process, but also the product. Next is assessment. Assessment also works best when it is continuous, ongoing, and not episodic. Assessment also works best when it is continuous, ongoing, and not episodic. So assessment should be cumulative because improvement is best achieved through a linked series of activities done over time in an instructional cycle. Now let us discuss the principles of assessment. So for the first one, the first principle of assessment is assessment should be valid. When we say valid, validity ensures that assessment tests and associated criteria effectively measure students' attainment of the intended learning outcomes at the appropriate level. So it is important that your assessment is valid. And of course, it should be associated. The criteria that you're using is associated with the learning outcomes that you wanted to have in that particular subject. Next is, it should be reliable and consistent. So there is a need for assessment to be reliable, and this requires clear and consistent processes for the setting, marking, grading, and moderation of assignments. So then the third principle will be information about assessment should be explicit, accessible, and transparent. When we say information about assessment should be explicit, accessible, and transparent, it should be clear, accurate, consistent, and timely information on assessment tasks and procedures should be made available to students, staff, and other external assessors or examiners. So it is important that when you create an assessment, there should be a clear and accurate, like for example, direction on what to do and what should be done so that the students will be able to answer it appropriately and of course effectively. Next is assessment should be inclusive and equitable. When we say inclusive and equitable, as far as is possible without compromising academic standards, inclusive and equitable assessment should ensure that tasks and procedures do not disadvantage any group or individual. So make sure that it is inclusive. Especially in education, we make sure that education is inclusive. It should not discriminate any other, like for example, group of people or individual. Make sure that every one of them will be able to answer it with ease and being comfortable. Next is Principle 5. Assessment should be an integral part of program design and should relate directly to the program aims and learning outcomes. So assessment tasks should primarily reflect the nature of the discipline or subject, but should also ensure that students have the opportunity to develop a range of generic skills and capabilities. So it should not just reflect on the nature of the discipline or the subject itself, but make sure that this will also give students the opportunity to develop their skills and capabilities. Next is the amount of assessed work should be manageable. So the scheduling of assignments and the amount of assessed work required should provide a reliable and valid profile of achievement without overloading staff or students. So make sure that you are not overworking your students, especially like for example in creating assignments or tasks. Make sure that they are able to achieve that particular task within an enough time. You don't need to like give them bombarded assessments or tasks just to make sure that they are working, because that is overloading already. So make sure it should be enough for a time being. Also, formative and summative assessments should be included in each program. So when we say formative and summative assessments should be incorporated into programs to ensure that the purposes of assessment are adequately addressed. So many programs may also wish to include diagnostic assessment. So when we say formative, just like what I've mentioned before when we have our discussion, formative assessment is a type of assessment wherein you are using it on that time of the discussion. So every after discussion, you will have an assessment to check if they are able to understand the lesson. Now, summative assessment is a periodical type of assessment wherein you will have this test. Like for example, here in DDOSC, we have our assessment like prelim, midterm, and final. So the summative assessment is like prelim examination. Next is the timely feedback that promotes learning and facilitates improvement should be an integral part of the assessment process. So students are entitled to feedback on submitted formative assessment tasks and on summative tasks where appropriate. So the nature, extent, and timing of feedback for each assessment task should be made clear to students in advance. So as we have actually as a future educator, it is important that you know when to give feedback, and it should be in a timely manner. Like for example, you have asked them to create an essay. Make sure that after submitting the essay, you will check it and then you will provide feedbacks. Like for example, if there are grammatically incorrect statements there, make sure to correct it. Put comments, and then if ever it is verbal, you need to provide all the feedback needed. But it should not be it should be given like positively. Make sure that you're not hurting their feelings. Next is staff development policy and strategies should include assessment. So all those involved in the assessment of students must be competent to undertake their roles and responsibility. So before, like for example, us teachers, before we will be able to like teach the students, we have our educational background. We need to study education for like 4 to 5 years. Aside from that, we are also joining a lot of seminars and webinars just to make sure that once we do the role as a teacher, then we are already ready and competent. So the next one will be our there will be variety of assessment instruments. So there are several assessment instruments that we used in assessment. We have actually 5. First is objective examinations. Objective examinations, the advantage of using this type is that teachers are familiar with it, although constructing high quality test questions may be difficult. When we say objective examinations, the example for this one is written exams, like for example multiple choice questions, like that. Next is essay examinations. So essay examinations allow for students' individuality and expression, although it may not cover an entire range of knowledge. When you say essay examination, this is subjective. So every individual has his own expression, perception on things. So when you do this particular examination, make sure that you have a rubric for that. Next is written work. This type allows learning in the process as well as in the completion of the process. So disadvantage is that plagiarism may occur and written work is difficult to quantify. Like for example, journals, reflection paper. So this is the type of written work, which is nowadays, at least nowadays, it would be easier for teachers to know if this is their own work or if this is being plagiarized, since we have a lot of tools that we can use like Turnitin, Grammarly, and many more. We also have here portfolio assessment. So when we say portfolio assessment, it may either be a longitudinal portfolio which contains reports, documents, and professional activities compiled over a period of time, or best case, thematic portfolio which is specific to a certain topic or themes. So usually we have portfolios, especially like for example, when we have FS or field study, we usually ask our student to have portfolio of all the documents needed on that particular subject. Now we also have here the assessment rubrics. So assessment rubrics is used in essays so as because in an authentic assessment tool which measures students' work, it is important to use rubrics. Rubrics would give us a knowledge that this particular product or output is really authentic. And it is a scoring guide that seeks to evaluate students' performance based on a full range of criteria rather than a single numerical score. So that was the end of our lesson for lesson 4, or this is lesson 1 for module 2. Make sure to watch the video until the end to answer your assessment. Thank you.